vital sector.
Thank you very much, and great to see the great work that's going on in my honourable friend's constituency. Of course, that is a question for the Base Secretary. I'm sure he's considering it very carefully.
Nia Griffith.
Question number 1. That's number 8, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to answer this together with question 13, as am I. There was cross-party consensus at the time that those schemes were launched that we needed speed to protect jobs, and because of our action, unemployment peaked at 5.2%, not the 12% predicted at the start of the pandemic. We designed those schemes to prevent as much fraud as possible, and lenders stopped nearly £2.2 billion of potential fraud from the bounce-back loan schemes. We continue to take action on multiple fronts to recover money that has been fraudulently claimed.
Nia Griffith.
But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just a matter of fraud, it's also a matter of incompetence. The NAO has been scathing about the UK wasteful spend of £37 billion on private contractors to deliver the track and trace system in England, whilst in Wales we had a more efficient system through partnership with Welsh Government and local councils. So what guidance is the Minister giving to other government departments to avoid such wasteful contracts in the future? And does this guidance include considering, wherever practicable, the delivery of service contracts through public authorities, where any profit would remain in the public purse?
We always continue to encourage best value, and this is at the heart of all Treasury documents on the use of public money. It is, to the Honourable Lady's point about test and trace, it is very important, of course, to reaffirm the great majority of the costs associated with this scheme were about testing as opposed to tracing, and it was only that scheme which allowed us to come through the enormous challenges of the period, particularly prior to the availability of the vaccine, in a way which allowed our society and our wider economy to keep going to the extent that they could.
Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has... number 13. How do we get to 13?
Just your question.
Okay, thank you. My right honourable friend has been incredibly agile in responding to exceptional crises. As he tackles the impact of Putin's war on our economy, will he take every measure to accelerate growth, including reducing taxes on fuel and energy?
Well, as has been discussed earlier in this session, as my honourable friend rightly highlights, the government recognises that households do need support with the rising cost of energy, and indeed the Chancellor's already provided support worth some £9.1 billion for financial year 22 to 23. On her wider point around boosting growth, the Chancellor outlined in his May's lecture the importance of the government investing in capital, people and ideas so that we can strengthen the economy and make sure that the UK is best placed to succeed in what is a challenging set of circumstances.
Shadow Minister James Murray.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, just in the last 7 days, we have learned that 7 billion items of PPE were not fit for purpose. The government is burning 500 lorry loads of it a month. And former Treasury Minister Lord Agnew admitted that the lack of anti-fraud measures in the government's COVID business support packages meant it was happy days if you were a crook. When billions of pounds of public money are being lost through the Chancellor's incompetence, is the Minister ashamed to be hiking taxes on working people by billions of pounds next month?
I'm afraid that the honourable gentleman misunderstands the situation in regard to PPE. Over 97% of the stock that was ordered was suitable for use, and indeed, when it comes to the wider figure that covers the PPE piece, 4.7 billion of that represents PPE that will be used by the NHS, but which was procured at a greater price than it carries today, owing to the scarcity that prevailed at that time. Another 3.3 billion represents PPE that can be used in non-medical settings, and DHSC have already sold and donated stock in this category. On the wider fraud point, it goes back to my earlier answer that we had to design these schemes at pace to protect jobs, and I think this was something which was agreed across this House, and we rightly, I think, made sure that that was the priority. We then built in the protections which were needed, and the protections have made sure that we are able to pursue anyone who has defrauded the taxpayer.
SNP spokesperson Alison Hewlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lord Agnew's evidence to the Treasury Select Committee last week was a damning indictment of this Tory government's terrible complacency, his words, to fraud and protecting public money. And he doesn't buy what the Minister says about working at pace either. Lord Agnew anticipates that there will be an avalanche of claims from the banks on the state guarantee of the bounce back loan scheme arriving at the Treasury in coming weeks. So can the Minister tell this House what actions he is taking to prevent yet further billions of public money waltzing out the door in the midst of a cost of living crisis?
Well, to the Honourable Lady's point, the Government set up the £100 million Taxpayer Protection Task Force at the budget back in March 2021, and that task force is expected to recover between £800 million and £1 billion from fraudulent or incorrect payments over the next 2 years. And that builds on the work that has already been done, which saw HMRC recover £536 million in 2020 to 2021. It's also the case, of course, that other agencies of the state are involved in this important work. The National Crime Agency has also made 17 arrests. Meanwhile, as of February 2022, 106 directors have been disqualified. There have been 48 bankruptcy restrictions and 13 companies have been wound up in the public interest in relation to bounce-back loans.
Emin Moore.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At last autumn's budget and spending review, we announced a comprehensive package of investment to level up the UK and encourage regional growth. This included the £4.8 billion Levelling Up Fund, the £2.6 billion Shared Prosperity Fund and £1.6 billion of investment in the next generation of the British Business Bank's regional investment funds.
Emin Moore.
Speaker, would my honourable friend agree with me that town deals are one of the most progressive ways of supporting regional growth, and the one for Southport will really kick-start our economy locally?
Well, I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend on all his hard work to secure the £37.5 million town deal for Southport, which will be truly transformative for his constituents. This funding will bring in more private investment to his constituency, building on that public funding, providing new jobs and opportunities for his constituents. It will be levelling up in action.
Catherine McKinnell.
The stark reality in the North East is that we've seen rising child poverty and reliance on food banks in recent years, and the poorest households have lost £1,000 when the government cut universal credit in the autumn. Rising prices look set to take away another £1,000 from households, and that's before the economic impact of what is happening in Ukraine. So can I urge the Treasury, ahead of the spending statement next week, to please do more to tackle the destitution that will be inevitable if nothing is done to intervene to support households in the North East, who then support the local economy to grow?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as other ministers have already outlined this morning, we are supporting households with the rising cost of living, including a package worth £21 billion worth of support, particularly supporting those, for instance, on universal credit by reducing the taper rate to make sure that work pays. And looking further ahead, through our commitment to levelling up, we are investing across the country through skills and infrastructure with the Levelling Up Fund to improve growth, to boost prosperity, to boost opportunities, to boost pay, and thereby improve people's standard of living.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware of the positive contribution that financial services can make to levelling up all over the country. And with that in mind, and the work of my APPG on financial services and markets on levelling up, could she commit that the Treasury will work with the industry to help spread opportunity within the financial services sector in order to help the financial services sector spread opportunity through all regions of this country?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point. I know he's very knowledgeable about this sector. It's also very important to remember that actually financial services is something which is to the benefit of the whole country, with two-thirds of jobs in financial services being outside London and the South East. So absolutely, financial services is an important part of our ambitions for levelling up.
Speaker, in rural communities, especially in Cumbria, we are deeply concerned about the government's apparent lack of concern about growth in the rural parts of this country. In particular, is she aware of the enormous damage being done to farming in the UK, just at the moment when we need our farmers the most, by the reduction in basic payments, which started in December, where farmers lost between 5% and 25% of their basic payment without any availability of anything to replace it for years to come? Will she intervene now to keep basic payments where they are currently so we can keep Britain farming?
Oh, well, I thank the honourable member for his constituency. I also represent a rural constituency with significant agricultural interests. I can assure him that we have protected the agricultural funding through this Parliament, and we're committed to levelling up across all parts of the UK in rural as well as urban areas.
Dean Baker.
What steps is she taking with our right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, to ensure that areas needing levelling up are able to attract private sector investment?
It's a very important point to make. Levelling up isn't just about public sector investment. In fact, the lion's share of investment in future growth in our economy will come from the private sector. One of the very important things that the British Business Bank is doing with its regional funds is actually crowding in private sector investment. So we'll get more private sector investment on top of the public sector investment we're putting in.
Mr. Speaker, the Shared Prosperity Fund could be one of the government's most effective means of encouraging regional growth across the UK, but only if the investment goes where it's most needed. So does the Minister believe that the Treasury should apply the funding commitments that were rightly made to Cornwall, also both to the Tees Valley, but of course to South Yorkshire as well?
Well, we're making a substantial investment through the Shared Prosperity Fund and also other funds across the country. We have committed to make sure that the Shared Prosperity Fund will be at least as much as parts of the country would receive before through EU funding, and I'm committed to his area just as much as Cornwall and other parts of the UK.
Peter Gibson.
11, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By investing in local infrastructure, the Levelling Up Fund will strengthen local economies, boost job opportunities and improve the day-to-day lives of people across the UK. So far, we have committed £1.7 billion to 105 projects, and at the end of this month, the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities will publish its monitoring and evaluation strategy for the fund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With £23.3 million invested through the Towns Fund, £105 million for Banktop Station and 1,700 civil service jobs coming to Darlington, we are a leading example of how this government's levelling up agenda is benefiting communities in the North East. The second round of the Levelling Up Fund will continue this work. Will my honourable friend outline what the timescales are for the delivery of that round?
Well, my honourable friend is a fabulous campaigner for Darlington, evidenced in all the funding his local town has secured. I am a regular visitor to Darlington, as are my colleagues on the Treasury front bench here, and I have seen those investments already making a difference. My honourable friend asked about the second round of the Levelling Up Fund. It will open for bids this spring, and further details will be published shortly.
Question 12, sir.
Minister.
Will you continue to review and reform our regulatory and enforcement approach to ensure that illicit finance evolve? Our responses do too. We've announced an unprecedented package of sanctions, including against prominent Russian oligarchs. We brought forward the bill last night to crack down further, and we will continue to do further work on the Economic and Crime Bill in the next session. We've also brought a new kleptocracy cell into the National Crime Agency to tackle those explicit threats. But, Mr. Speaker, it took a group of anarchists to seize Deripaska's London mansion yesterday. So when is he going to do what Europe and America have already done and seize, rather than just freeze, Putin's cronies' assets? And when is he going to close those loopholes that still allow them to escape sanction by putting their assets in their family members' names or using shell companies based in British overseas territories? Well, this government has worked very closely with the US and the EU on a whole range of interventions. We've sanctioned 500 individuals and entities, including 386 members of the Russian State Duma. We've also worked with the US on the expulsion of banks from the SWIFT banking system. We've cut off 3 million Russian companies from capital markets. And we've also seen $250 billion wiped off Russian stocks. We will continue to work closely with our allies to ensure that the response continues to be comprehensive.
The Minister, Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has once again delayed the long overdue reforms to Companies House, which could have deterred illicit finance, prevented COVID fraud and provided vital information to the authorities. So I want to ask the Minister an important question, and I want him to update the House accurately. How many Russian-linked individuals and businesses have wrongly been given Treasury-backed COVID-related business support?
Minister. Well, we worked to give widespread support to lots of individuals across the economy. I won't be able to give the Honourable Lady the exact chapter and verse on individuals who've been supported, but what we'll continue to do is work on the Company House reform, which will be the most significant reform that we've had in 170 years of the Companies Register. We will publish a second economic crime plan and fraud action plan later this year to address the threats that we continue to see.
We go to topicals with Marcia de Cordova.
Topical question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, in response to Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, the Treasury has helped deliver a world-leading package of economic sanctions to deliver severe consequences to the Russian economy across insurance, finance, trade, public and private capital markets, clearing, SWIFT, central bank assets and indeed bank asset freezes. We are ensuring that this government plays a leading role in making sure Putin's aggression does not go unpunished.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are families in my constituency facing the cost of living crisis, and the planned real terms cut to social security is going to force more of them into poverty and having to make impossible decisions between eating or heating their home. Now, according to the Trussell Trust, 1 in 3 on universal credit have not been able to dress appropriately for the weather last month as they were unable to afford appropriate clothing or shoes, and this is unacceptable. So will the Chancellor increase the level of social security support in his spring statement next week in order to alleviate some of the worst impacts of the cost of living crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as is common in all other years, welfare is uprated annually by September CPI, and that will be the case next year as well, as my honourable friend laid out previously. But for those on universal credit, of course, we did cut the tax rate in universal credit to ensure that work pays, delivering a £2 billion tax cut to 2 million people on low incomes, the best route out of poverty, Mr. Speaker.
Giles Watling.
With the cost of fuel reaching record levels, we face a cost of living rise across the board. Everything we consume has to be delivered in Clacton. That can be a long way. France is offering rebates. Germany a fixed price reduction. Has my right honourable friend considered special reductions, say 15%, for vital fuel users such as haulage companies?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to point out the importance of fuel as a cost both of business and to household. That's why I'm proud that we delivered the 11th in a row freeze in fuel duty, which has delivered huge savings to household and businesses over the past several years.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Millions of people are worried sick about soaring bills. Meanwhile, BP have said that they've got more cash than they know what to do with, and have compared their record profits from inflated prices to a cash machine. These profits are not being used to fund new investment. They're going on dividends and on share buybacks. So why won't the Chancellor make North Sea oil and gas companies pay their fair share of taxes to tackle this enormous cost of living crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talks about a fair share. It's worth bearing in mind that oil and gas companies are already taxed at double the rate that all other companies are taxed at, 40% versus currently 19%. And last year saw the lowest amount of investment in the North Sea on record, just a few £1 billion. And we know, as my honourable friends who were at the roundtable yesterday, there are billions of pounds of projects waiting to be unlocked, and we want to see that investment and those jobs here in the UK.
Rachel Reeves.
They're not doing that with the share buybacks. The Chancellor is totally out of touch. He doesn't seem to understand how the cost of living crisis is affecting the least well-off in society, as campaigner Jack Monroe has highlighted. The Institute of Fiscal Studies confirmed that the poorest households face an inflation rate 50% higher than the richest. The Resolution Foundation warned that between 2020 and 2022, 700,000 more children are going to fall into poverty. That is devastating, but it is not inevitable. The Chancellor can and must do more in the spring statement and provide people with real help, not just a loan. So why is the Chancellor so intent on shielding oil executives instead of protecting the poorest in society? investment.
So, well, Mr. Speaker, the best way to help people cope with rising energy cost bills over time is to make sure we have a diversified and secure supply of energy, more of which comes here at home, Mr. Speaker. But with regard to those on the lowest incomes, Mr. Speaker, I share the Honourable Lady's concern for those on the lowest incomes. That's why I'm proud that all the evidence points to the fact that the decisions made by this government over the last few years have benefited those on the lowest incomes the most. We have protected those who need our help, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do so.
Richard.
Speaker, further to our recent K11 meeting, has the Minister had an opportunity to consider my proposals for a traffic light system scheme to inform the public of the tax approval status of investment schemes?
Well, it's very interesting to meet with my honourable friend, the member for North West Leicestershire, together with his colleagues from the APPG on investment fraud, and interesting to hear his idea. As we discussed, HMRC is very keen to make clear which schemes do not work, which is why in the Finance Act of 2022, the government legislated to allow HMRC to name promoters and the schemes they promote at the earliest possible stage, to warn taxpayers of the risk of entering into those schemes and to help those already involved to exit avoidance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Research by Scope showed that 1/3 of disabled households were already living in poverty last year. NatSend's recent report on health and disability benefits, commissioned by the government, further illustrates the devastating impact of insufficient financial support. So ask the ministers what they have to say to disabled people who are already struggling and are now living in fear of worse to come.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are spending record amounts supporting those who are disabled, and relative to the OECD, I think in excess of the average of other leading countries. But I know my honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, has a particular programme of support in place to help those who are disabled move into employment, and plans were announced earlier this year.
And Rose.
Speaker, in his last budget, the Chancellor slashed universal credit withdrawal rates, delivering an 8% tax cut for the least well-off. But, as I explained in Poverty Traps, the combined deductions from income tax and benefits withdrawals often still top 70% for the lowest paid. If tax rates above 45% destroy work incentives for high earners, why should it be any different for low earners too? How much more opportunity, energy and ambition could we unleash if these regressively high and unfair rates were cut even further?
Well, he's right to highlight the effect of a high effective tax rate on incentives to work, and that's why the government reduced the universal credit taper rate from 63p to 55%, and increased the universal credit work allowance by £500 per year, which is essentially a tax cut for the lowest paid, worth over £2 billion in 2022 to 23, and means 1.9 million households will keep, on average, an extra £1,000 per year.
Waste recycling businesses face an increase in tax on red diesel of thousands of pounds per month from April. I take it that the Chancellor agrees with me that waste recycling has important economic benefits as well as environmental. So can he tell me what plans he has to address these sudden rising costs for businesses who process and reuse waste materials?
Well, I would say to the honourable member that the changes to the taxation of red diesel that he's referring to were announced back in 2020. They were confirmed in spring 2021 and now coming in this year. So businesses, including the sector that he refers to, have had plenty of time to prepare for this. And it's absolutely right that we tax fuels which are highly polluting, and unfortunately diesel is one of these.
Mortimer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hartlepool proudly stands with Ukraine and fully supports the sanctions imposed on Putin's regime. But could my right honourable friend tell me how the windfall post-Brexit refund of £200 million from the European Coal and Steel Research Fund will be spent supporting our steel industries?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I know my honourable friend is an active campaigner for the steel sector in her constituency, I can assure her that energy-intensive industries such as steel do receive substantial support from the government, including free allowances from the Emissions Trading Scheme and the £315 million Industrial Energy Transformation Fund to help them cut energy bills.
Samuel Wilson.
Yesterday's order paper, there was an SI entitled "The Customs Amendment EU Regulations 2022 brought forward for approval." This would have amended the customs arrangements for the United Kingdom by excluding Northern Ireland from them, changing the term United Kingdom to GB. This runs totally contrary to the assurances given by the Prime Minister that Northern Ireland remain part of the UK customs territory. It runs contrary to Article 4 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it now means that not only is Northern Ireland part of the single market under the European Court of Justice, as outside the customs territory. Can the Minister give an assurance, now that this has been adjourned, that it will not be brought back to the House until there has been a meeting to explain why it's necessary, what its impact on Northern Ireland is, and why the Government has brought it forward?
I'm very happy to answer that question. I understand completely the concerns of the people in Northern Ireland about the impact of the protocol, and the honourable member will know how seriously the government takes that and how it is negotiating with the EU to ensure that we get the right arrangement for Northern Ireland going forward. I would like to reassure the honourable gentleman, and I can give that assurances here and now, about what that statutory instrument was doing. It was making very minor technical changes in a number of areas. For example, in relation to the provision of information that might have to be given that was never enforced previously, and was actually easing up the requirements for those operating trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. These were technical changes.
Thank my right honourable friend for his swift actions to protect final consumers from rising energy prices. However, we're all aware that emergency intervention is not sustainable in the long term and undermines our need to end our reliance on foreign fossil fuels. But fracking is not the solution. And I want to ask my right honourable friend what steps he will take to invest in domestic renewable and nuclear energy, the fuel of which is manufactured and filed, as well as improved energy efficiency.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend makes an extremely good point. Now is a moment for us to go full steam ahead with our transition away from fossil fuels. We are investing in nuclear, we are accelerating our progress on renewables, and we are boosting energy efficiency in homes across the country. This is how we're going to bring bills down, we're going to improve our energy security, and we're tackling climate.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. When the government set up the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, they recklessly failed to agree any guidance on early repayments, resulting in businesses now being charged extortionate fees and facing bankruptcy. Why is the Chancellor putting the profits of unscrupulous lenders above the recovery of our small businesses?
Well, he isn't. The schemes were set up in various ways, depending on the size of businesses. It will be for individual people who've borrowed money to engage with the lenders to refinance those loans on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Residents in my constituency who live in mansion buildings which buy their heating centrally do not currently benefit from the energy price cap. This is clearly an anomaly. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss possible ways that we can ameliorate this situation?
My honourable friend makes an important point. We do recognise that there are people living in mansion blocks where they're part of a heat network and they're not covered by the price cap. One thing I can point her towards is the discretional funding, the £144 million that went to local councils as part of the recent £9 billion energy support package. I'll also say that in forthcoming legislation we're giving Ofgem new powers to regulate prices in this sector as a matter of priority.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We really must start seizing assets and not just freezing them. That's the only way that we can make sure that the money goes towards the reconstruction of Ukraine. Wouldn't it also be a good idea if we weren't just looking at the really famous people like Abramovich, but the people who own £750,000 properties in the UK, who may be cousins or brothers or sisters or parents or some other proxy of Russian oligarchs in the UK? And mustn't we really do far more to tackle the personal finances of President Putin, much of which is, I'm told, in the UK?
the honourable gentleman, as ever, makes a powerful point on a very important matter. There's ongoing work, working with our allies, to look at how we can deepen our response in a coordinated way in order that we make a real impact on illicit finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regularly visit businesses across my constituency and have been very fortunate to meet some very talented apprentices who are eager to develop their skills and build a career. Does my right honourable friend agree that apprenticeships will play a key role in closing the skills gap by helping young people gain employment in high-skilled roles? And can he advise what actions the government are taking to encourage more employers to take on more apprentices?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point. He's absolutely right to champion the value of apprenticeships. That's something this government believes in keenly. I had a great round table with apprentices in Newcastle recently, and I heard for myself just what a difference they're making to both their employer and the wider economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor's smash and grab on national insurance is estimated to raise £13 billion. By happy coincidence, the Chancellor has an extra £13 billion worth of borrowing that he could make use of as at the end of the year, when we haven't met the borrowing expectations. Will the Chancellor use that happy coincidence to scrap now the tax on jobs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the forecast for public finances will be updated next week. But with regard to jobs that the honourable gentleman raised, I'm happy, Mr. Speaker, to confirm the numbers this morning. There are record numbers of people on payrolls, record numbers of vacancies, and indeed more people in work than we had before the crisis, and indeed an unemployment rate that is now lower or the same level as it was before coronavirus hit.
Final question, David Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the government has repealed many of the powers in the 2020 Coronavirus Act, but it hasn't repealed the Act itself, which means the Treasury can now still order HMRC to start support schemes like furlough without recourse to Parliament. Control of expenditure is Parliament's first responsibility. So is the government going to repeal this Act in total, or is the Treasury going to take action to give the proper powers back to Parliament?
I'm very happy to look into the matter the honourable gentleman raises.
We now come to the urgent question. I call Lee Anderson.
Speaker.
Urgent question.
In the UK. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to Putin's barbaric acts in Ukraine and against the Ukrainian people, we need to keep all of our energy options open. We've always been clear that the development of shale gas in the UK must be safe and cause minimal disruption and damage to those living and working nearby sites. This is not a new position. Shale gas and new approaches could be part of our future energy mix, but we need to be led by the science and have the support of local communities, and that was in our general election manifesto, which he and I stood on at the last election. The pause on fracking, implemented in November 2019 on the basis of the difficulty in predicting and managing seismic activity caused by fracking, remains in place, and we will continue to be led by the science on our approach. Mr. Speaker, we're clear that shale gas is not the solution to near-term issues. It would take years of exploration and development before commercial quantities of shale gas could be produced. Additionally, fracking relies on a continued series of new wells, each of which produces gas for a relatively short time. Even if the pause were lifted, there is unlikely to be sufficient quantities of gas available to address the high prices affecting all of Western Europe, and would certainly have no effect on prices in the near term. As the Business Secretary has said, we will continue to back our vital North Sea oil and gas sector to maximise domestic production while transitioning to cheaper, cleaner, homegrown power at the same time. Mr. Speaker, we will shortly set out an energy supply strategy which will supercharge our renewable energy and nuclear capacity, as well as supporting our North Sea oil and gas industry.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, last Wednesday, the Secretary of State for Business told this House it did not necessarily make sense to concrete over the wells at the Preston New Road site in Lancashire. Now, given that these are the only two viable wells in the whole of the UK, pouring concrete down them would be the end of the shale gas industry in the UK. And this would be an inappropriate step at this time. And we're in the midst
Mr Speaker, of an international crisis. And as the Prime Minister himself said, the West has become addicted to Russian gas. And this is something we must rectify immediately. It is a national emergency. And this House was assured last week that both the Business Department and Number 10 agreed that these wells should not be filled. However, government rhetoric is not being matched by action on the ground. And Quadrilla, the company that owns the wells, has spent the last 6 days trying to get hold of anyone at Bays or the Oil and Gas Authority to receive confirmation that they no longer need to carry out this abandonment process. But they are being ignored. Officials are dragging their heels, and now with just days to go, Quadrilla are still legally obliged to plug the wells by the 30th of June, and the OGA keeps confirming this. The Business Secretary says that they should formally request an extension. This is nothing but Jobsworth mentality, but that's just kicking the can down the road, and we'll be back here having the same arguments in a few weeks' time. Instead, can I ask the Business Secretary why he just doesn't give a practical effect to the words that he uttered last week and instruct the OGA to reverse the decision to concrete the wells? That's what they're waiting for. Either the government thinks these wells should be filled or it doesn't. To concrete or not to concrete is the question. Frack or not to frack. If we don't want to see concrete being poured down our only viable shale gas wells in the middle of an energy crisis, the Business Secretary needs to act quickly. As Western civilisation grapples with an energy crisis, I'm at pains to understand why the government risks jeopardising Britain's long-term energy security over some tiny procedural nonsense. The course of action is clear to me. Now, I hear some chuntering in this House today, but I would challenge any MP, Mr Speaker, in this House, any MP, to come to my constituents, speak to some real people who are struggling with their gas bills. Not one person in this place has to worry about paying their gas bills, so hang your heads in shame.
Mr Speaker, I thank you very much for his engagement, and I know that he has got a long-standing interest in energy on a number of different fronts, so I commend him for his continuing interest. First thing I would say, Mr Speaker, is this, that nothing has changed on government policy in relation to fracking and shale gas. In terms of the international crisis, he says the West is addicted to Russian hydrocarbons. I would say the UK is not. The UK, we import less than 3%, 4% it was last year, but typically less than 3% of our gas from Russia. The figures for oil are higher, but they're nothing like the sort of eye-watering percentages that we see from European friends and partners. And finally, when it comes to the holes in Preston New Road in Lancashire, I can tell him that the Oil and Gas Authority, the independent regulator, has proactively approached Quadrilla as recently as this week to ask if Quadrilla will apply for an extension. However, Quadrilla hasn't made a straightforward application to do so. As with any licensee, if Quadrilla want to extend this deadline, they can apply for a straightforward extension from the Oil and Gas Authority. And Mr Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and I met with the Oil and Gas Authority today, and they are ready to consider Quadrilla's letter and potential application, and the government hopes the regulator would consider it favourably.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me congratulate the honourable gentleman on securing the UQ. I think he's right to try and smoke out the government's position, and it's no wonder he's confused, but he'll still remain confused, I think, after the minister's replies today. Let's be clear, Mr Speaker. The government placed a moratorium on fracking because they said it was dangerous and could not rule out unacceptable impacts on the local community. The Business Secretary said in 2020, fracking is over. Just a few days ago, he said it would come at a high cost for communities and our precious countryside. Yet last Wednesday, just 3 days later, the same Business Secretary said, and I quote, the government is open to the idea in the House. But yesterday at Chatham House, the Minister ruled it out. They are completely all over the place on this, Mr Speaker. So let me ask him some questions, because this does matter. It's about our energy security, it's about communities deeply worried about the impact of fracking and about the climate crisis. Let me ask him this first question first. Has he or his department seen any scientific evidence since the moratorium of 2019 which suggests that fracking might not be dangerous and might be safe? If he does not have any evidence, why is he approaching the Oil and Gas Authority to not concrete over the wells when that was a decision originally made? If he doesn't think fracking is safe, why is he sowing uncertainty in those communities around our country? If he doesn't have any evidence also, will he assure the House that but there will be no review of fracking, no nods, no winks, no nudges announced in the relaunch of the government's energy strategy. Clarity on this really matters. And finally, Mr. Speaker, isn't the truth the best thing the government can do to guarantee energy security, and he should just be clear about this, is have a green energy sprint, ending the onshore wind moratorium, ending the objection to solar power, embracing tidal power, moving forward with nuclear, and a properly funded national energy efficiency programme?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to see him in his place at the dispatch box today. He says he's confused, Mr. Speaker, but I have been absolutely clear that government policy is unchanged. I'm not sure what he finds confusing about government policy being unchanged. It is unchanged from the 2019 manifesto. Now, we did not, in 2019, put our manifesto on an headstone, Mr. Speaker. But I will have to say to him, it is clearly available for anybody to see online what the manifesto pledges that this side of the House all ran on, and government policy is unchanged, Mr. Speaker, from then, with or without an headstone. He is saying that it's sowing uncertainty. No, Mr. Speaker. Actually, we have given absolute certainty here that government policy is unchanged from the pause announced in 2019. There is no review. We still have the pause from December 2019, which would be a science-led policy with the support of local communities if there were to be a change. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, we heard about the green energy sprint. It's absolutely extraordinary. Since he was the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in 2010, we have increased the proportion of our electricity generation coming from renewables from 7% to 43%. Now, in any normal terms, that would be a sprint, but it's also a marathon in the sense that we have done that over a period of 12 years, almost a sextupling, Mr. Speaker, if I might, of the amount of energy coming from our renewables compared to the time when he was in office. He talks about nuclear, Mr. Speaker. But he will also remember the 1997 Labour manifesto when they said they saw no economic case for new nuclear power stations. And now he has the cheek, Mr. Speaker, to come to the dispatch box today and urge that we get on with nuclear. The government is getting on with nuclear, Mr. Speaker, and is getting on with renewables, doing exactly the green energy sprint he has suggested.
A member whose constituency has been mentioned in this, Mark Menzies.
Just outlined at the start that this does affect my constituency, and I am disappointed that the member for Ashfield did not have the courtesy to give me advance notice he was asking a question pertaining to my constituency. Mr. Speaker, these are not viable wells, and can the Minister just confirm that? The wells in 2012 that caused the first national moratorium were concreted over with the blessing of Quadrilla. The last thing they wanted to do at that point, Mr. Speaker, was frack again in those wells. So they dug 3 miles away. And both those wells, Mr. Speaker, have triggered the second national moratorium. So they are not viable wells. So can the Minister confirm that and stop this nonsense now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend illustrates the point very well about the importance of keeping local community support if this were to happen. We definitely, as stated in the manifesto, is based on what local communities felt at that time. And I don't think any local community felt it more strongly than his and filed. In terms of the actual process here, we have been clear that if Quadrilla were to apply to the Oil and Gas Authority for an extension to extend that deadline, it would be considered by the Oil and Gas Authority in the usual way. And, Mr. Speaker, I repeat that the Secretary of State and I spoke with the Oil and Gas Authority just this morning to confirm that.
Spokesperson Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a rare time in the Chamber, I completely agree with the Honourable Member for Fylde and the Minister's opening remarks. Now is not the time for knee-jerk reactions. Given we've got this energy crisis, now is the time to stay strategic and not make daft decisions. And it's quite clear that doing fracking would not do anything to change the West's reliance on gas, even if, say, the UK doesn't rely on Russian gas. The Minister can reconfirm that fracking wouldn't release enough gas that would actually change the international market price anyway, so we'll still be paying the same wholesale prices. And isn't it the case there isn't enough geological and scientific core and information to the right depths to actually understand the viability of extraction let alone the risks of seismic tremors that we've already heard occurred at Pesson Road, and therefore fracking should be ruled out the way Scottish Government's done it. And isn't it the case that we need to heavily invest in renewables? We keep hearing about nuclear from the two front benches. Commit to £63 billion of capital and financing costs to Sizewell C is madness. It should be straightforward renewable energy. I keep going on about pump storage hydro. Last week the Secretary of State said, I've been going on about pump storage hydro for 18 months. It's a good solution, but it needs to assess value for money. When are we going to get that value for money? When are we going to get a change to the transmission grid charging system, which is blocking deployment of Scottish renewables? And we need to invest more in tidal stream, increase the floating offshore target and set an onshore wind target as well. And let's maximise investment in renewable energy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank him for that response. And look, he is right. In the first part of what he says, fracking is unlikely to change prices on gas, or UK frack is unlikely to change it, and certainly unlikely to change it quickly, which is what I said in my opening statement. He's also right to point to the importance of following the science, and geological information is really, really important. However, Mr. Speaker, I do have to say to him on nuclear, he continues to be wrong. The SNP's ideological, hardcore opposition to nuclear is against Scotland's interests. We've just seen the closure of the Hunterston nuclear power station, which provided enough nuclear energy to supply every home in Scotland for 31 years, Mr. Speaker. It was a great Scottish as well as UK solution. And when it comes to our other great source of gas, the North Sea, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see the SNP approach becoming more constructive and more supportive of the North Sea transition deal that the UK government did a year ago.
Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Speaker, may I support what my right honourable friend is saying about the need for more renewables, the need for nuclear, and that we all support the objective of net zero by 2050. But we now are in a gas supply crisis. The government insists we are in a European market. Europe is heavily dependent on Russia. We need to produce as much gas as we can. And it's a very simple question. Is shale an option for the government in the immediate term or not? That's what we need to know. Otherwise, the wells will be concreted over, which is what the government said they don't want.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for that question. I particularly thank him for his support for renewables, nuclear and for net zero. All of those three things belong together and right at the centre of government policy. He said it was a gas supply crisis. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't characterise it that way. The UK has got very secure sources of gas supply. Around about 50% comes from the UK continental shelf. A further 30% comes from Norway, our great friends and allies, NATO allies. 20% is bought on the international market. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't share. There is an issue with price, obviously, but I don't share his characterisation of a gas supply crisis. And finally, asked, is shale an option? Look, as I repeat again, government policy in this area is unchanged. If people can show that the scientific base and the local community support is there, then government policy would be to allow shale if that turned out to be where those two key considerations led to, Mr. Speaker.
Davis.
Yeah, can I say, Mr. Speaker, as the Council of Europe Rapporteur on hydraulic fracturing, that the Minister may know that of the methane produced by fracking, 5% is leaked through fugitive emissions. And as methane is 80 times worse than CO2 for global warming, that makes fracking worse than coal for global warming. So instead of looking at fracking, will he redouble his efforts on renewables in England in terms of wind farms, in Wales in terms of marine, and also look to store renewable energy in organic batteries that produced on scale are cheap and also don't end up with pollutants?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a few questions within that. In terms of his data on emissions, the one thing, it would be impossible to really judge what emissions on UK fracking would look like, because there hasn't been data produced on that. What I would say, he says that fracking is worse than coal. What I can be certain of is that LNG is has more emissions in the production of LNG than there is in the UK continental shelf natural gas. That is for sure, 2.5 times as much. So I would expect him to be rallying behind our call to maintain the UK continental shelf production going on at the moment and to import, hopefully, less LNG. And then he talks about redoubling renewables, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, we have the Europe's largest installed offshore wind capacity. We are already committed to quadrupling that, Mr. Speaker. That is twice the rate of the redoubling he's calling for.
So, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The moratorium introduced seismic limits that were ridiculously low and appeared to be written by someone who didn't understand the Richter scale. Should it not be the case that these decisions should be taken by local planning authorities with community involvement and set at limits similar to that we might see for development in London, for example? And should we not be locking in community benefits of fracking sites?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he mentions, thank him indeed for his question, and also he's somebody else who is very, very supportive of government policy on energy, particularly in nuclear, which I strongly commend him for. He mentioned seismic limits. What I would say, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't the Energy Minister at the time, but I believe that tens of thousands of complaints came into the Royal Geological Society at the time of the drilling, which I think showed, if you like, the magnitude of the public impact of some of that drilling at the time. And finally, his point on local consent, I refer back to what I said earlier in terms of the importance of this, the need to bring local communities on board in any of these projects, Mr. Speaker, in pretty much every type of energy. You need to bring the local community on board, and that is the case here as well.
Samuel Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's been much hand-wringing in this House about the cost of energy, energy security, our reliance on outside sources, and yet within our own country we have sufficient gas to do us for 50 years. Does the Minister think it's sensible to turn our back on the jobs, to turn our back on the taxes, and to spend money buying gas overseas when we've got an indigenous source, a pipeline across the United Kingdom, and one of the richest and deepest shale gas seams in the world?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are not turning our back on anybody. We have been absolutely clear that keeping our energy diversity is important to us, vital to us. Keeping our energy security is vital to us. So we are not turning our back on anybody or anything. But here, government policy is unchanged. We need to see both the scientific evidence and the local community support to be able to proceed, which is what we laid out in our 2019 manifesto.
Alexander Stafford.
Mr. Speaker, it's reassuring to hear from the government that the community support is going to be at the heart of any decisions. So I can tell the Minister that in Rother Valley there is no community support for fracking. In Hart Hill and Woodsets, where there are potential wells, nobody wants it. In fact, in Woodsets, fracking site is mere yards from an old people retirement home. Can the Minister confirm that this government focuses more on renewables, not on fracking? Because every single minute this government spends talking about fracking is a minute not spent talking about renewables. Is a minute engineers are not working on renewables, and we need to get that online, not fracking.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he again makes a really strong point, my honourable friend, who I know also takes a strong interest in energy matters, particularly on renewables. But he makes a really strong point on the need to keep local support and local consent on these projects. And he's quite right. The focus on renewables is very strongly there. It's the Prime Minister himself who describes the country as the Saudi Arabia of wind. The commitment to renewables comes right from the very top of our government, throughout the government, Mr. Speaker.
Catherine Smith.
Speaker, the member for Ashfield in his question characterises his constituents as being real people. Can I reassure the member that the people of Lancashire are real people? The people of Lancaster and Fleetwood that I represent are completely opposed to fracking in Lancashire, and I'm sure I speak for my friend from Fylde as well. The reality is that shale gas is currently paused. So can the Minister, when he says that we would need support from local communities, can he be sure that he is hearing loud and clear from Lancashire that Lancashire said no, people in Lancashire do not want fracking? Can he reassure my constituents that these wells will be concreted over and that the government will consider turning this pause into a ban on fracking?